Take a deep breath and join me as we journey into the past where each tale unfolds with the richness of lives lived, transporting us to another era entirely. The room is quiet now, and the only sound is the low ticking of a nearby clock. But in your mind, you are somewhere else. You are limping. Yes, limping across a stone floor worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The pain in your foot is sharp, relentless, like fire nestled deep within your big toe. Welcome, dear listener, to the colorful and uncomfortable history of gout. The foot you're dragging has swollen to twice its size. You probably won't survive this, at least not without a good dose of humility, a pillow under your ankle, and perhaps a small mountain of dried cherries. Gout is not merely an ache, it's a historical badge of wealth, gluttony, and curious medical theories. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And post your location and local time. I'm always curious where and when we're drifting off together. Wherever you are, I hope tonight brings you rest, comfort, and maybe a curious dream or two. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You recline now anachronistically at a table so overstocked with roast meats, eels, and aspic and spiced wine that the table legs creak under the weight. You're in the thick of a medieval feast somewhere in Europe, though this scene could just as easily be ancient Rome or 18th century London. Wherever there is indulgence, gout is sure to follow like an unwanted but oddly respected guest. The attack starts in your toe. Always the toe. This is the classic podagra, the inflammation of the big toe joint described again and again by physicians from antiquity to the present. It swells, it burns, and it turns the deepest crimson as if a candle has been lit inside it. One 18th century physician poetically compared it to a wolf gnawing one's bones. Charming. Why the toe? Historians still argue whether the location is anatomical bad luck or simply a symbolic warning to walk less and recline more. Some suggest it's gravity at play, uric acid crystals, drifting downward to settle in your most vulnerable corner. Others wonder if early physicians just really like talking about feet. But back to the banquet. Gout thrives where indulgence reigns. Historically, it was dubbed morbus dominorum, the disease of lords. A badge of class and cuisine, it was almost enviable in some circles. After all, to suffer gout, one must first afford the kind of lifestyle that invites it. The tables of the rich were laden with purine-rich delicacies, liver kidneys, shellfish, wine, red meat, more wine sweetbreads, yet more wine. And the results, swollen joints and sleepless nights. Gout was the bill presented by the body after a decadent meal. Of course, the irony is delicious. The disease of kings could bring emperors to their knees and scholars to their bedchambers. Charlemagne limped with it. Henry VIII, famously rotund and gouty, is almost inseparable from its legacy. Ben Franklin once quipped that gout was his only enemy he could never outwit. But let's step even further back, because this crimson pain, while best known in the royal courts of Europe, goes far beyond powdered wigs and port wine. The earliest medical texts describe afflictions suspiciously gout-like. In ancient Egyptian scrolls, there's reference to joint pains that come and go, often in the feet, often in older men. Though the word gout hadn't been coined yet, the symptoms were unmistakable. Swelling, burning, a sense that the body had turned traitor. In Mesopotamian tablets, scribes lament mysterious aches in the limbs, possibly an early diagnosis in cuneiform. Gout, it seems, was there at the dawn of record-keeping, hiding in the shadows of our first empires. Even then, rich food and strong drink may have stirred the chemistry of pain. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some historians suggest that early Egyptian embalmers, yes, the ones who packed the dead with natron, may have noticed telltale urate deposits on certain elite corpses. Like crystalline chalk, these mineral clumps formed around joints and organs. If true gout was embalmed into history quite literally, another fun fringe theory, gout was once thought to protect its sufferers from other more serious illnesses. A 17th century physician confidently claimed that those who possess the gout possess also long life. If your toe burned like a furnace, congratulations, you might dodge the plague. Back at the feast, you raise a goblet to your lips, though carefully now, as your knuckles are beginning to ache. The servants clear away the dishes and lay out a tray of sweetmeats and fruits, but all you can think about is getting your boot off before the pain spreads. You don't want to make a scene. After all, you're in polite company. And here in this moment, reclined, refined, and racked with inflammation, you become a textbook case. Not just of gout, but of history's complicated relationship with indulgence, identity, and disease. By morning, the pain may subside. You'll walk again. But the memory of the flare will linger, as will the quiet understanding that some afflictions are as timeless as feasts themselves. You're no longer in a candlelit banquet hall. Now you're beneath the unforgiving sun of the ancient world, standing barefoot on the hot, cracked tiles of a temple floor. The Nile glistens in the distance. Papyrus rustles. And somewhere nearby a high priest grits his teeth in silence. His foot, bound in linen and swollen like a baked fig, rests awkwardly on a stone stool. This is Egypt over 3,000 years ago, and the priest is likely suffering from what we'd now recognize as gout. But no one calls it that yet. Here disease is divine judgment, or perhaps imbalance a cosmic inconvenience sent from the gods. He reaches for a poultice of honey garlic and powdered antelope horn. A local remedy. Useless, of course, but very on brand for the time. In his culture, pain isn't just physical, it's spiritual, social, even astrological. Maybe he insulted Horus. Or maybe he ate one too many fatty goose thighs. You walk past rows of painted columns where wall reliefs depict men offering food to gods, platters of meat, fish, wine. Historians still argue whether these depictions suggest religious ritual or just elite status, but what's clear is this high-status Egyptians ate well. Too well. And there in their prosperity, gout was waiting. Fast forward 1,000 years and 1,000 miles east, and now you're in Sumer. The world's first true cities are buzzing around you. Clay tablets pile high on wooden shelves. Cuneiform scratches out lists of livestock taxes and ailments. One such tablet from Lagash, or maybe tells of a man whose joints swell like overfilled waterskins, and who cannot walk when the moon is full. That might sound poetic, but a few scholars believe it to be one of the earliest known references to chronic arthritic flare-ups, possibly gout. Or maybe he just stubbed his toe after a few too many date wines, who knows? Here's a strange tidbit: some Mesopotamian healers believed disease could be chased out of the body by transferring it to a clay figure. They'd mold a tiny version of you, whisper the symptoms into its ear, then throw it into a river. And honestly, if you've ever had gout, that sounds just desperate enough to try. The thing is, in both Egypt and Sumer, there was an unspoken correlation between status and suffering. The rich consumed more than they needed: more meat, more beer, more fermented milk, and the body responded. Slowly, painfully, vengefully. And in both cultures, we see the same strange twist: these early gout sufferers weren't looked down on. If anything, they were held in high regard. Pain, especially exotic or dramatic pain, became a marker of importance. You'd earned it. Now step into the shadowy inner chamber of an Assyrian temple. Here records speak of limb-stiffening curses and fire demons in the feet. Again, likely exaggerations, but also strangely accurate for describing a gout attack. The Assyrians had a god for nearly everything, including Nergal, lord of both war and disease. Coincidence maybe, but if anyone was going to weaponize gout, it would be the Assyrians. Here's another fringe theory. Some believe that ancient foot baths filled with lotus oils or beer weren't just for relaxation, they were medicinal attempts to relieve swollen joints. That's right. Foot spas for the elite might have doubled as primitive uric acid relief stations. Though, to be fair, if you had the means, you were probably soaking your feet in beer anyway. You leave the temples and markets behind and drift west over desert sands and Mediterranean waves toward the marble columns of Greece. But don't rush, gout has plenty of time. It always does. And in these ancient civilizations, you see the early roots of what gout will become. Not just a condition, a character, a symbol, a kind of status symptom whispered about in scrolls and scratched into clay, dressed up in gods and rituals and poultices, but unmistakable all the same. Your foot throbs again as if in sympathy with the past. You wiggle your toe experimentally. No help. Still stiff, still inflamed, still vaguely noble. And as you limp back through time, you realize something rather delicious. Gout didn't just survive the centuries, it adapted. It followed the rich, the clever, the comfortable, like a very fussy, very sharp-toothed pet, the kind you can never quite get rid of. The stones beneath your feet shift again, and suddenly you're surrounded by white marble and salt-blown breezes. You're in classical Greece now, home of oracles, olives, and an entire civilization built on balance and reason. Or so they like to say. But even here, amidst the noble ideals of moderation, someone always takes the second helping of roast lamb. And once again, gout arrives like an uninvited philosopher. You're in a shaded courtyard in Kos watching Hippocrates. Yes, that Hippocrates lecture a crowd of young physicians about the four humors. He's scribbling furiously with a stylus, his white beard fluttering like a bird's nest in the breeze. He talks of yellow bile, black bile, blood, and phlegm. Everything in the body, he says, must be kept in balance. Too much of one humor illness, swollen joints. Likely a disturbance in your bodily temperaments. Maybe too much phlegmatic cold, maybe not enough fiery bile. Or maybe you just drank 6 goblets of wine and called it dinner. Hippocrates is one of the first to record gout with some degree of medical clarity, though he never calls it that. He observes that it seems to affect wealthy men more than poor ones. Women too, but only after menopause. This leads him to his most infamous gout-related theory. Women are protected from gout by their monthly cycles, what he rather quaintly calls purging through the flow. Science was still stretching its legs clearly. Here's your first quirky tidbit of the night. Hippocrates warned that too much walking could disturb the humors and inflame the feet. This advice, of course, was deeply comforting to people who didn't want to exercise anyway. And here's the second, another physician, Galen of Pergamon, would later write, that gout might be linked to overheating the soul. He believed certain personalities, passionate, indulgent, intellectual, were simply more prone to diseases like gout. A hot-headed philosopher he figured was more likely to boil from within. Historians still argue whether this interpretation of gout as both medical and moral ailment originated in Greece or crept in later from Roman Stoicism. Either way, it stuck like a burr to the ankle of medical thinking for centuries. You walk now through the Stoa of Athens, brushing past statues and scholars. Socrates debates ethics at one end. At the other, a well-fed merchant limps quietly with a cane carved from cypress wood. No one says the word gout, but it hangs there all the same in every wince, every stifled grunt, every sandal strap loosened discreetly under the table. Greek physicians begin to record strange similarities between patients with swollen feet, good appetite, red eyes, ruddy complexion, and an apparent fondness for eels and honeyed figs. They experiment with treatments, barley water, leaching vinegar compresses, and diets heavy in boiled vegetables and light in personality. Spoiler, the eels win. You stop for a moment in the healing sanctuary of Epidaurus where pilgrims come for miraculous cures. Here patients sleep in sacred halls hoping for dreams sent by Asclepius. Some wake cured, others not so much. You peek at a stone inscription listing ailments supposedly healed here. One of them mentions fire in the foot that was charmed away in the night. You suspect someone was being optimistic. Meanwhile, back in the symposium where wine flows freely and the cheese plates never empty, men boast of their intellectual vigor while carefully hiding their swollen ankles. The rich wear soft slippers and lie on couches, all in the name of philosophy, of course. You begin to notice the quiet correlation: the sharper the mind, the more tender the toe. There's even a kind of gout-related snobbery brewing. Being afflicted becomes in a strange way a sign of status, like owning a white marble statue of yourself or quoting Homer from memory. Gout, it seems, means you've made it. One medical scroll from the 4th century BCE notes with suspicion that no beggar has ever been diagnosed with the foot fire illness. The writer doesn't consider this proof of beggars' good health, only that they haven't earned the privilege of such a refined disease. Charming right. As you limp alongside philosophers and healers, it becomes clear that ancient Greece didn't cure gout, but it did something just as lasting. It philosophized it, framed it, wove it into the very language of status, reason, and self-inflicted suffering. Here, gout became more than pain, it became personality. You glance down at your foot again. Still swollen. Still red. Still throbbing like a little drumbeat, reminding you that history, despite all its noble ideals, is deeply unfair to the joints. From white marble colonnades, the world tilts west. You find yourself sprawled on a couch, not unlike the Greeks, but this time you're in a Roman triclinium, where the dining is more opulent, the conversation louder, and the gout somehow even more enthusiastic. You're not walking anymore. You're reclining propped up on embroidered cushions, sipping Falernian wine that's older than some cities. Around you, senators in embroidered togas hold forth about taxes, Saturnalia parties, and which general looks best in armor. But half of them are hiding twitching feet beneath their drapery. Because in Rome, gout isn't a disease, it's a lifestyle. You reach for a plate of dormice stuffed with herbs and pine nuts. Yes, dormice. The Romans considered them a delicacy. Also on the menu, pickled fish guts, flamingo tongue, and so much wine your vision might legally qualify as mythological. No surprise that gout feasted right along with them. This is where things get oddly specific. Roman physicians start naming gout explicitly: podagra for the foot, chiragra for the hands, gonagra for the knees. You'd think they were cataloging fine wines, not pain. Scribonius Largus, one of Emperor Claudius's doctors, recommended a poultice made of boiled turnip and goose fat. That's right. If you smelled like Sunday dinner, it was medicine. Here's a wonderfully weird tidbit Pliny the elder naturalist and know-it-all once suggested: rubbing the gouty joint with the blood of a freshly killed owl. This would allegedly frighten the inflammation away. Of course, it might also frighten your dinner guests away, but details. And here's another gem. One Roman noble claimed his gout flares were due to too much thinking. He insisted his brain overheated, and the inflammation flowed downward. You have to admire the creativity. Historians still argue whether the Romans saw gout as a moral weakness or simply a side effect of winning at life. On the one hand, satirists like Juvenal mocked wealthy men hobbling on ivory crutches. On the other, gout became a kind of anti-poverty flex. If you had gout, you had arrived. You drift now through Roman baths where marble statues drip with condensation and old senators stew in mineral water groaning softly. They believe hot springs can draw out the pain. Some swear by mountain ash bark, others by crushed pearls mixed into vinegar. Nearly all of it is expensive, almost none of it works. One wealthy Roman Lucius Crassus famously commissioned a bronze footstool with a built-in foot cooler, essentially the world's first gout mini-fridge. His slaves carried it around so he could elevate his foot in style during debates in the Senate. One can only imagine the legislative gravitas of a man who cannot stand. And speaking of emperors, let's not ignore the biggest, goutiest presence in the room. Caesar, or rather several Caesars. Some sources suggest Augustus suffered foot pains in his later years, Tiberius too. But it was Emperor Hadrian. Yes, the one with the wall, who reportedly kept a team of physicians solely to manage his chronic joint pain. A literal senate of swelling. The public image of gout remained oddly two-faced. Roman writers simultaneously mocked it and romanticized it. Martial joked that his friend's toe was so red it should vote in the Senate. Meanwhile, medallions and frescoes showed wealthy men lounging glamorously, wine cup in one hand, foot wrapped in expensive linen. You can't help but notice the recurring theme: indulgence brings status, and status brings gout. Whether it's oysters or oratory, the richer your pleasures, the more your joints will mutiny. The sun begins to set over the Palatine Hill. You shuffle slowly down a colonnade, your toga flapping around your ankles. Children run past barefoot and laughing. None of them have gout, not yet. That's a privilege for their futures if they're lucky enough to grow rich and slow. As the shadows lengthen, you wonder whether gout is a punishment or a prize, a mark of success or a red flag of excess. The Romans never quite agreed, but they all agreed it hurt. And somewhere just beyond the marble columns and fig trees, a physician is preparing another owl. The torches gutter out, and you find yourself wrapped in the cold stone silence of a medieval monastery. Candles flicker weakly against damp walls. Outside, the wind whistles through cloisters. Inside, the gout continues its pilgrimage. You're seated beside a robed monk, hunched over a manuscript, his quill trembling in ink-stained fingers. Every so often he pauses to wince and gently flex a swollen toe beneath his habit. The illuminated text before him shimmers with gold leaf, but the pain in his foot is decidedly less celestial. In the Middle Ages, gout quietly slips from banquet halls into cloisters and castles. The diet changes, but the suffering persists. Here in Europe, monks eat surprisingly well eggs. Cheese ale, salted fish goose. Not exactly gluttony, but a far cry from starvation. The richer the monastery, the richer the diet, and so inevitably the goutier the feat. You pass a scriptorium where a prior is dictating a psalm while rubbing his ankle with a poultice of crushed nettles and old beer. It's a cure of sorts. In fact, medieval medicine believed nearly anything could be a cure if applied vigorously enough and with appropriate prayers. One odd little prescription from a 12th century herbal compendium advises applying ashes of burnt owl mixed with vinegar and boar fat. That poor owl again. In some villages, gout was treated by binding a live frog to the foot. It was believed the creature would draw the illness into itself. The frog was not consulted. Here's a delightful fringe theory. Some historians believe gout was perceived as divine correction in the monasteries. God's reminder that even the pious must suffer. The pain kept monks humble, or at least quieter, though a few chronic sufferers did earn the nickname St. Lawrence's Fire after the martyred saint who was roasted alive. Subtle monks were not. Historians still argue whether medieval records reflect a true rise in gout cases or simply a change in literacy and record keeping. The written word spreads, and with it detailed complaints about sore feet. And while the poor toiled in fields and died of fevers, the nobility and well-fed clergy complained of a burning toe. Because gout, ever selective, still preferred those with access to mead meat and manuscript margins, you slip through a stone corridor to a castle's great hall, where lords in fur-trimmed robes drink wine from goblets the size of chamber pots. A bard plucks a tune, a jester juggles pears, and a baron, his foot propped on a velvet stool, grimaces every time he laughs. He wears 2 rings on each finger and none on his toe. It's far too swollen for adornment. Gout in the medieval court becomes part of the aristocratic wardrobe. Just as one might wear a brocade tunic or carry a jeweled dagger, one also carries a cane and a subtle grimace. "Oh, it's the gout," he says, as if discussing the weather. And while physicians suggest fasting and leeches, alchemists offer powdered emeralds and concoctions made of dried millipedes. Everything sparkles, nothing helps. One rather bold healer suggests drilling a hole in the foot to let out the excess humor. His career ends shortly after that. You'd think gout might humble the nobles. It doesn't. If anything, it makes them feel special chosen. After all, you must feast like a king to suffer like one. It's a kind of suffering that whispers, "I have the luxury of pain." You return to the monastery just as the bells begin to toll. A novice limps quietly to his cell, clutching a rag soaked in vinegar and garlic. He whispers a prayer not for health, but for sleep. You lie down on a rough straw mat. The stone floor beneath you is cold. Your foot throbs, whether from memory imagination or inherited inflammation you can't say. But here in the echoing halls of medieval Europe, you begin to understand gout isn't just a condition. It's a ritual, a performance, a consequence, and above all, a reminder that even the quietest lives can ache. Now the flickering candles of the monastery are replaced by the blazing torches of a royal court. You find yourself beneath a painted ceiling so high it echoes, hemmed in by brocade tapestries, glinting armor, and the pungent aroma of roast pheasant. This is the age of kings, and gout is their most loyal companion. You're in the court of England's Henry VIII. Yes, that Henry, the one with the 6 wives and the aggressive taste in banquets. He strides, or rather waddles, across the hall in silks and fur, scowling as he lowers himself onto a carved throne. One leg juts out awkwardly, foot-swollen like an overstuffed pastry. He doesn't tight it. Why would he? His gout is practically an extension of his crown. Henry's court physicians described his attacks as fiery, persistent, and of grave inconvenience to majesty. They prescribed everything from sweet oil rubs to laxative tonics to reduce hot humors. But Henry, never one for subtlety, mostly ignored them. Instead, he ate, drank, and dictated from his reclining chair with a grimace. Gout had finally reached its golden age. If you were a king, prince, pope, or grand duke in the Renaissance or late medieval period, chances were good that you'd eventually develop a limp. And when you did, you didn't apologize, you owned it. Across the channel, France's King Louis XIV suffered frequent flare-ups, once refusing to stand during an entire audience with the Polish ambassador. Spain's Charles V was said to conduct council meetings from bedfoot propped high on embroidered pillows. Even Russia's Peter the Great winced his way through reforms, though he preferred vodka to wine. Here's a quirky tidbit: some courtiers began to mimic the walk of the gout-afflicted, slow, measured and stately, as if to suggest they too had achieved the refined suffering of the elite. Gout in this way became performative, a limp with benefits. And here's another. A few daring poets began to refer to gout as Cupid's revenge, a flirtatious consequence of too much love and too many truffles. This sounds absurd until you remember that Renaissance medicine believed all excesses, lust, wine, thought boiled down to the same overheated internal forces. Historians still argue whether monarchs truly suffered from more gout than the average person, or if their wealth just made them more visible, more documented, more swollen on the record. Either way, paintings from the period often show rulers looking powerful and slightly pained. The hand on the sword, the foot off the ground. You move now through courts in Florence and Prague, where merchant princes debate trade routes while quietly massaging their toes beneath velvet robes. Leonardo da Vinci sketches human anatomy in the corner, but even he glances occasionally at the bishop beside him, frowning and pale from a long night of pain. The Renaissance was all about spectacle, and gout fit in perfectly. Here was a disease that didn't kill, but reminded you daily of your mortality and privilege. And in a time when public image meant everything, gout's dramatic flair was almost welcome. Of course, the treatments remained as theatrical as the illness itself. Leeches were still in vogue, as were bleeding bowls and powdered coral. Some kings commissioned special gout chairs with cutouts for swollen feet. Others employed foot-bearer servants tasked with cradling the royal ankle during long sermons or state processions. You know you've made it when someone's job is to hold your pain. And then there's the Spanish court physician who insisted on boiling crushed emeralds into a syrup for his gouty king. The resulting concoction nearly bankrupted the treasury and cured absolutely nothing, but it sparkled in the goblet, and that was enough. Night falls over the castle, and the courtiers drift away. You hear the sound of lute music in a distant chamber and the low mutter of prayer. A king sighs heavily in his bed leg, bandaged and trembling. You realize with a strange kind of calm that gout has become not just the affliction of kings, but a kind of crown in itself. Painful, heavy, and worn oddly enough with pride. The firelight dims, and you're ushered forward into the golden haze of the Renaissance. Proper a world of powdered wigs, gilded libraries, and wine that never quite stops being poured. You pass beneath chandeliers and frescoed ceilings, weaving your way through perfumed salons where philosophers argue and cardinals conspire. And everywhere, lurking in embroidered stockings and behind polite smiles, gout makes its glorious return. You step into the study of Michelangelo, the master sculptor himself. He's pacing slowly, carefully, as though his foot might shatter. Beneath his robes, his ankle is wrapped in linen. He's been chipping away at marble all morning while also swearing at a flare-up that started sometime around breakfast. It turns out painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling doesn't just hurt your neck. Across the room, a wealthy Florentine patron murmurs about a new remedy made of rose oil and deer antler ash. Soothing, he says, and fashionable. You don't ask questions. You just nod and imagine how deer antlers ended up on someone's inflamed toe. The Renaissance did not tone gout down. If anything, it turned it into art. Here's your first fringe tidbit. Some Renaissance physicians believed that gout was a kind of divine filtration process, a way for the body to excrete excess intelligence. Essentially, the smarter you were, the more likely your joints would rebel. In a world obsessed with genius, gout became the swollen footnote to brilliance. And another one, Milanese alchemist, attempted to create a tincture using distilled moonlight, claiming it would cool the passions and ease the uric fire. It didn't, but it made for an excellent party story. Historians still argue whether Renaissance attitudes toward gout were genuinely reverent or laced with sarcasm. The truth likely lies somewhere between. Gout appeared in literature and satire alike always dramatic, always symbolic, always just painful enough to be taken seriously. You drift now into the courts of the Medicis where cardinals in crimson sip aperitifs and debate Aristotle while discreetly icing their ankles with damp silk rags. One bishop leans forward and whispers that his left toe flared. During a sermon on temperance proof, he chuckles that God has a sense of irony. Meanwhile, artists paint their patrons with one foot subtly turned away from the viewer, as if hiding a telltale bulge. Some portraits include ornate slippers or sandals that look suspiciously accommodating. Others make no effort to disguise it. Gout is a sign of wealth, of erudition, of having lived a little too well. In England, you visit the chambers of Thomas More, who, according to some accounts, suffered from sore-footedness during his final years. His letters are elegant, his philosophy sharper than a dagger, and yet he ends several notes with mentions of a rebellious toe. You suspect even Utopia couldn't protect him. And then there's Erasmus, Renaissance scholar extraordinaire, who famously wrote that gout gave him more time to read. He joked that every flare-up was a forced vacation with his books. It's an inspiring thought if you can ignore the searing pain and buckets of cold compresses. Treatments evolve, of course. Renaissance apothecaries offer refined tonics made with rhubarb saffron and wine steeped in copper coins. Some even recommend boiled fox lungs. You hear of one curious practice placing roasted onions under the feet during the night to draw out the fiery vapors. Whether the vapors left is unclear, but the smell certainly lingered. By now, gout has begun to acquire character. It is petulant, dramatic, a bit of a diva, and yet deeply respected. You stroll through candlelit libraries where scholars dictate to scribes from armchairs with legs carefully propped. They do not complain, they muse, they reflect. They recite Latin between flinches. Some even say half seriously that gout is a mark of divine preference. Better a gouty mind, one professor notes, than a sound-footed fool. And you begin to see what they mean. In the world of the Renaissance, everything is performance. Gout is merely another costume piece. It limps, yes, but with purpose. You recline now beneath a painted sky frescoed with angels and thunderclouds. Your foot aches, but your thoughts are clear. The candles flicker, the wine breathes, and the pain, it waits for you to finish your next brilliant idea. The oil lamps dim and flicker, and once again you are lifted forward in time now into the salons and parlors of the Enlightenment. Welcome to the age of reason, where powdered wigs are taller, waistcoats are tighter, and gout ever loyal follows philosophers and founding fathers like a shadow in silk stockings. You're seated now at a long table in Paris. Around you, men argue with elegant fury about liberty astronomy and the nature of pain. One man, portly and flushed, has his foot tucked onto a velvet cushion beneath the table. Every time he shifts, he winces. He is Voltaire, and his opinions are as sharp as the fire in his joints. Voltaire referred to his gout as my demon, and my familiar depending on the day. It often struck when he was mid-thought, perhaps, as he finished a sentence mocking the church or defending the rights of man. But he welcomed the interruptions with a kind of philosophical resignation. After all, if suffering existed, it must exist for a reason. Even if that reason was wine and cheese. Not far away, Benjamin Franklin nods sagely. He too is battling a gout flare. During his diplomatic missions to France, he complained of attacks that left him hobbling through Versailles with barely contained sarcasm. In fact, he once wrote an entire dialogue between himself and his gout. The gout speaks with confidence you have ate and drank too freely, and too freely indulged your legs in rest. Franklin, to his credit, conceded the point. Here's your first quirky tidbit. Many Enlightenment thinkers personified their gout. It wasn't just pain, it was a debate partner, a punishing muse, a judgmental roommate who always showed up when the wine was good and the argument better. And here's your second, Immanuel Kant. Philosopher of order and routine, was rumored to schedule his daily walks and bowel movements with such precision that his neighbors could set their clocks by them. Yet even he couldn't plan around the chaos of gout which interrupted his musings with brutal irregularity. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of gout among Enlightenment figures reflected their diets or their obsessive workloads. Some say it was rich food. Others point to long hours at writing desks and late-night discussions fueled by port. Likely it was both and neither. Gout, after all, never needed a clear reason, only a willing host. You drift through London past the Royal Society where Isaac Newton is scribbling furiously by candlelight. He too had his struggles with inflamed joints, though whether it was strictly gout or a more generalized wear and tear from a life spent bending the universe is unclear. Still, he reportedly walked with a limp in later years and often massaged his legs during lectures. The Enlightenment gave us scientific method, human rights, and revolutionary ideas, but it also gave gout a new kind of glamour. No longer just a noble affliction, it was now a thinker's disease. Proof that you were not just wealthy but interesting. You passed through the court of Frederick the Great of Prussia, a lover of philosophy and flautist with a taste for military uniforms and melancholy. He writes to Voltaire about foot pain in delicate passive-aggressive French. It's a surprisingly human moment from a man known for a battlefield ruthlessness. Meanwhile, over in Boston, John Adams wakes with a groan. His diaries are full of notes about aching limbs and sleepless nights. His friend Thomas Jefferson, meanwhile, claimed he avoided gout by abstaining from port. This may be the most Jeffersonian claim in history, an attempt to out-reason inflammation itself. Of course, treatments continue to evolve or devolve depending on your perspective. Some Enlightenment apothecaries favored cool river compresses. Others leaned into bleeding purging and elaborate herbal cocktails involving ground amber molasses and the occasional snakeskin. You sip a delicate glass of claret. Your toe nestled in a satin slipper pulses like a ticking clock. But no one in this parlor minds. In fact, several of the guests are limping. You begin to realize Enlightenment salons may have been built on ideas, but they were walked through slowly and painfully by gouty men in lace. And so you recline like Franklin or Voltaire, one foot raised in quiet rebellion against the Enlightenment's ideal of perfect reason. Because no matter how much you think, discuss, or draft, your body always gets the last word. You blink and the powdered wigs and parchment contracts dissolve into something even more ornate. Welcome to the Georgian era, where everything from conversation to architecture is trimmed with excess. You've arrived in the 18th century, a world of brocade jackets, sherry by the gallon, and dining habits that would give modern nutritionists immediate cardiac arrest. Unsurprisingly, gout doesn't just survive here, it thrives. You're in a drawing room now. Walls lined with oil portraits of glowering ancestors, each more gouty looking than the last. A fire crackles. A footstool sits proudly in the center of the room, not for display, but because the master of the house, Sir Reginald Something, refuses to dine without elevating his treacherous foot. That's what he calls it. Not just my foot, but the treacherous foot, as though it has a mind of its own and has personally wronged him. The table is being set with oysters, beef tongue, aspic molds, and jellied eels. You begin to see the problem. Georgian society was fascinated by display of wit, of wealth of pain. Gout ticked every box. You weren't truly a gentleman until you'd hobbled down the promenade, clutching the cane tipped with ivory, your gait slow and theatrical. Here's a curious tidbit. Gentlemen's clubs in London, places like White's or Brooks's, began offering special footrest stations for gout sufferers, complete with padded stools and velvet foot robes. Being unwell was so common among the elite, it became part of the service package. And some nobles commissioned custom-made gout shoes with open toes and extended leather flaps that could wrap around swelling without pressing down. It was part medical device, part fashion statement. You know you're deep into a trend when your footgear needs a hinge. Historians still argue whether the Georgian gout boom was caused by diet alcohol or something more insidious like chronic lead poisoning. Lead, after all, was used to sweeten wine and glaze tableware. Some researchers suggest that it may have compounded uric acid buildup, giving even the most moderate gentleman a lifelong limp. But moderation was not the Georgian way. These were the years of aristocratic excess fox hunts, followed by 10-course breakfasts, afternoon brandy, and late-night arguments about Rousseau. The waistlines swelled. So did the feet. As you make your way through the dining room of a country estate, you see a physician leaning over a baronet's foot, muttering something about invisible crystals and temperamental liver spirits. The baronet just moans and waves him off. "Bring the Madeira," he says. "If I must suffer, I'll do it properly." The image of gout changes again in this age. No longer just the badge of kings and scholars, it becomes a gentleman's malady. Something half the House of Lords can relate to. Something that arrives not in disgrace, but with the pedigree of tradition. Even the language changes. Where earlier centuries spoke of the fire or foot fevers, Georgian letters refer to the affliction in polite euphemisms. "My visitor has returned," one earl writes. "That unruly tenant in the south wing," says another. It's as if pain has moved into the house and is now expected to behave with a certain dignity. Still, the treatments remain dubious. Sulfur baths become fashionable. So do gout diets, which usually recommend the exact opposite of what's helpful. One popular 1770 tract warns against cabbage and leeks, but fully endorses wine, veal, and hard cheeses. You can practically hear the foot joints cracking in protest. And then there's the wild stuff like goat's milk therapy or foot immersion in electrified water. Yes, electricity. One inventor claims his device will shock the crystals into harmony. It mostly shocks the user into buying new shoes. But for all the bravado, you occasionally glimpse the quiet misery beneath the ritual. Letters written in shaky hands describe nights of sleeplessness, of hiding the foot from servants out of pride of struggling to mount a horse or kneel in prayer. And yet no one considers giving up the port. You rest now in a parlor scented with lavender and beeswax polish. Outside, carriages roll over cobblestone. Inside, a gouty squire snores beside the hearth, one foot gently steaming in a linen wrap soaked in warm gin. He looks peaceful, almost content, as though, despite the pain, this ritual of swelling and retreat of fire and forgiveness has become part of the rhythm of life. Not a detour, but a chapter. The curtains part again, and now you're in the gloomy, clove-scented office of a Georgian-era physician. It's all walnut cabinets, dusty apothecary jars, and an uncomfortably high number of leeches. You sit politely while he rattles off a list of remedies for your inflamed foot, none of which inspire confidence. The era's approach to gout was theatrical, a mix of science superstition and wild optimism. Physicians wore powdered wigs and grave expressions even as they prescribed such helpful things as vinegar foot vapors or a thorough bleeding from behind the ears. You are now the patient leg draped over a cushion embroidered with someone else's coat of arms. A physician with trembling spectacles inspects your toe with the solemnity of a priest examining a cursed relic. Yes, he says. Textbook gout. A clear case of elevated bile and the melancholic temper. You nod, trying not to laugh or scream. Both feel equally appropriate. Here's a fringe favorite. One treatment involved applying a mashed turnip heated in goose fat directly to the swollen area. Why goose fat? Unclear. But it makes you smell like an overcooked Sunday roast, which at least distracts from the pain. And here's a second gem. A popular 18th century medical almanac recommended letting a spider crawl over the affected foot while reciting Psalm 6. This had precisely the same therapeutic effect as doing nothing, but came with the added bonus of panic if you hated spiders. Historians still argue whether the growing medical literature on gout in this period marked true progress or just more elegant nonsense. Certainly, the number of published pamphlets ballooned. Every barber surgeon with a book press offered his own gout gospel. Still, some treatments weren't entirely misguided. Compresses using willow bark containing a precursor to aspirin offered real pain relief even if users didn't know why. And bathing in mineral springs, while overhyped, at least encouraged rest, warmth, and hydration. Not bad for a pseudo-scientific holiday. You follow the wealthy to the spa town of Bath, where the Georgian elite gather like pigeons in powdered wigs. Here, gout becomes a social event. You drink sulfur water that smells like eggs. You hobble from ballroom to bathhouse. You compare swelling with fellow sufferers as if trading stock tips. One bath physician, a flamboyant fellow named Dr. Kitely, prides himself on curing gout with thermic rituals, which are just a fancy way of saying he alternates hot and cold towels. He also believes swearing helps release toxins. His patients adore him. Meanwhile, in London, charlatans sell lightning cures for gout, some in pill form, others as metal trinkets you wear in your shoe. The idea is that the shock of nature can realign your humors. The only shock is to your wallet. Leeches, of course, never go out of style. Applied in clusters, usually around the foot or ankle, they promise to suck out bad blood. You try not to watch as a particularly plump one twitches with satisfaction. One nobleman famously imported Swedish leeches, believing they were more refined. They weren't. And then there's the surgeon who, with dead-eyed confidence, recommends cauterizing the foot with a hot iron to scare the affliction away. You politely decline. The strange thing about Georgian medicine is how earnest it is in the face of such dramatic failure. Physicians genuinely believe they are doing good. Their patients surrounded by mahogany and incense feel comforted, if not cured. The rituals matter. The velvet-wrapped footrests, the ceremonial poultices, the quietly whispered Latin. Even the failures are gilded with intention. You return to your chair as a young apprentice sets out a tray of syringes, herbs, and a warm bottle of port. Pain pulses up from your toe, but the sting has grown familiar, like a distant cousin who visits too often. You realize something peculiar. You almost respect the gout now. It's been your companion through temples, courts, monasteries, and now these dark wood-paneled offices of well-meaning men. And while none of their methods work especially well, their effort is sincere. Even if their best advice is, try not to think about your foot so much. Take the air. Avoid lentils. You'll try. After the port. The scent of pipe smoke fades, and your surroundings shift again, this time to a sun-soaked plantation veranda in the New World. The 18th century rolling into the 19th with the sleepy confidence of an empire on autopilot. You're in the age of global expansion now, and along with coffee gunpowder and unfortunate moral blindness, gout has successfully colonized the colonies. You rock gently in a cane chair on the porch of a colonial governor's house, perhaps in Virginia, or maybe Bengal somewhere heat-stroked and fragrant with jasmine and status. A servant arrives with a silver tray of iced tea or perhaps rum punch, if we're being honest, and somewhere under the hem of your linen trousers, a very inflamed toe demands your attention. Because Gout Dear Traveler didn't just stay in Europe, it traveled first class. British administrators stationed in the West Indies, India, or South Africa often brought more than maps and musket balls. They brought habits, meaty diets, sedentary lifestyles, lavish dinners, and gallons of fortified wine. In the colonies, gout became a badge of Anglo-civilization, an affliction that said, I may be 4,000 miles from home, but I still dine like a duke. Here's your first quirky tidbit in British India. The word gout was sometimes quietly swapped for Calcutta foot, not because the disease was uniquely Indian, but because it was everywhere British men went with too much brandy and not enough walking. It became a kind of in-joke among East India Company officials, and your second American revolutionaries, despite their zeal for liberty, brought a great deal of English culture with them, including gout. While fighting taxation without representation, they also fought swollen joints without anti-inflammatories. Historians still argue whether gout truly increased in prevalence during colonial expansion, or if the disease simply followed the penmanship well documented among elites, unspoken among common folk. But diaries from British officers, merchants, and plantation owners paint a vivid picture of a disease that crossed oceans as often as it crossed ankles. You now stand beside a sugarcane field, watching a portly landowner sip bourbon with one leg perched on an overturned crate. He's explaining in great detail the political advantages of rice tariffs, but between every other sentence he pauses to wince and gently nudge his boot off. Gout didn't care about your economics. It cared about your kidneys. Meanwhile, back in Boston or Charleston, physicians are copying European cures with local flair. Birch bark infusions, corn poultices, and the occasional swamp herb make their way into anti-gout elixirs. One particularly bold Charleston apothecary markets a syrup containing apple cider vinegar, foxglove, and a splash of whiskey. It works mostly because the whiskey makes you stop caring. The American South becomes a gout hotspot plantation, dining being rich, unhurried, and flush with meat. Governors host dinners with 10 courses and 24 side dishes, all seasoned with imported arrogance, and followed by slow, aching steps back to the study. Even in the North, the disease is well documented. John Hancock limped with it. Gouverneur Morris had frequent flare-ups. You imagine these men authors of constitutions and banking systems pausing mid-sentence to curse at their own feet. And then there's Thomas Jefferson, ever the outlier. He claimed his moderate lifestyle kept the affliction away. No port, he said. No rich meats. Just vegetables philosophy and architectural drawings. Which sounds suspiciously like someone trying to win an argument with his own body. But Jefferson aside, gout clung tightly to the birth of the New World. It wasn't just the disease of kings now, it was the disease of landowners, founders, judges, and clerks with enough wealth to sit, dine, and nurse their feet. In some cases, it even made its way into policy. One Virginia planter reportedly missed 3 votes in the House of Burgesses due to a flare-up. Another wrote legislation from bed with a silk slipper tied to his foot like a bell on a cat. You rock gently again on the veranda. The sun is setting. Fireflies blink across the sugarcane. A dog sighs in the dust nearby. And your foot still sore, still noble reminds you that even empires on horseback must occasionally pause for pain. Because wherever humans go with ambition and overindulgence, gout is already there waiting in the wine, crouching in the gravy, lurking in the imported linens, and smiling probably, You wake now in a parlor perfumed with peppermint oil and paternalism. It's the early 1800s. And the age of reason is now dressed in high collars, empire waistcoats, and a gentle hum of industrial gears in the background. The revolutions have quieted for now. The steam is rising, and Gout faithful, adaptable Gout keeps pace with the changing times. You're in a modest townhome in Philadelphia, where a founding father groans upstairs while a servant descends with an empty tray and a crumpled pair of slippers. Downstairs, the drawing room is full of respectable conversation, philosophy, banking, diplomacy, but beneath it all lies the unspoken thread. Half the room is nursing a flare. Benjamin Franklin, long gone, now left his imprint in more ways than electricity. His letters about gout, written with wit, grit, and just enough dramatic flair, become required reading for a certain kind of American elite. And with independence comes more than national pride. It brings gout across state lines like a loyal, painful inheritance. Meanwhile, in Virginia, James Madison takes to bed his foot raised on a small pillow, hand-stitched with the words, "Republic and Rest." Jefferson, still gout-free by reputation, sends a note suggesting a diet of lentils. No one follows it. And across the Atlantic, Britain's Regency period is underway, all corsets and cravats, excess and etiquette. You find yourself in a London townhouse beside Lord Byron, whose feet are tucked into a Turkish footbath as he recites poetry between curses. He calls gout the debt of pleasure and claims it gives him a right to sulk. His publishers are unamused. Here's your first curious detail. At this time, gout begins to appear in fiction. Authors like Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, and Tobias Smollett casually mention the condition, usually as a marker of status or stubbornness. A gouty uncle, a cantankerous baronet, someone off stage always complaining and always well fed. And here's a second: in some homes, a gout stool becomes a household item. These were low-cushioned platforms with cutouts, levers, or velvet pads designed to elevate the foot just so. You weren't a proper gentleman until you had one monogrammed. Historians still argue whether this period saw a peak in gout or simply a peak in complaining about it. After all, literacy was on the rise, and nothing inspires a good letter quite like pain and self-pity. You walk the halls of Parliament where lawmakers mumble about tariffs while tucking brandy flasks into their coat pockets. A gouty MP from Yorkshire is wheeled in for a vote leg propped on a pillow, muttering something about too much venison and not enough rest. Doctors of the era begin to take a more clinical tone. Gout is reclassified as a constitutional disease, believed to affect certain families more than others. Heredity joins the conversation. So does temperament. If you're passionate, intellectual, prone to melancholy or artistic dreams, well, you're probably ripe for inflammation. One enterprising physician publishes a treatise on the gout, in which he refers to the condition as the red-letter malady of the privileged. His solution: abstain from luxury. He's laughed out of half his clientele. Treatments grow more inventive. Soda powders. Tinctures of colchicum, an ancient remedy from the autumn crocus that numbs pain, and sometimes everything else. Spa towns thrive. Tunbridge Wells, Harrogate, Baden-Baden. You arrive wrapped in wool leaf reeking of minerals and return the following year with the same limp. In France, the post-revolutionary aristocracy tiptoes back into visibility, limping ironically under the same gout that once humbled their powdered ancestors. In Prussia, Goethe writes poetry about the soul while his foot soaks in cool water. In Russia, nobles sip vodka, complain of fire in the ankle, and insist it's a poetic condition. And in America, a quieter transformation is happening. The disease is beginning to lose its sparkle. The growing middle class sees gout not as a badge but a burden. Something old men have. something politicians hide, something to be managed, not displayed. But for now, it still walks proudly through dining rooms and courtrooms. It still lingers under lace cuffs and behind monocles. It still travels by carriage footstool in tow. You end your day in a drawing room that smells of nutmeg pipe smoke and liniment. A fire crackles. Your slipper loose and forgiving lies forgotten beneath your chair. Your foot pulses quietly, gently, but with absolute confidence. You're not sick. You're historical. Because in the world of early nations and late empires, gout is not a tragedy. It's a legacy. The candles flicker into gaslight now, and you're standing in a velvet-curtained Victorian parlor where propriety is stiff chairs are uncomfortable on purpose and moral judgment comes baked into every cup of tea. Welcome to the 19th century where gout is no longer merely a disease of wealth, it's now also a metaphor for moral failure. You take a seat beside a portly gentleman with mutton chops and an expression like he's been mildly insulted by his own leg. He's reading the Times while resting his foot on an embroidered cushion that reads, "Temperance is strength." The irony, of course, is that he's already on his third glass of fortified sherry and has requested more kidneys in cream sauce. Victorian society is obsessed with self-control, especially the control of appetite. And here, gout becomes a public embarrassment, a crimson badge that you've failed to moderate your urges. It's no longer an aristocratic flourish. It's a whisper in a drawing room. And yet it's still everywhere. MPs, judges, bankers, and bishops all hobble behind their reputations. Here's your first strange tidbit in 1848. An English doctor named Alfred Baring Garrod first identified the presence of uric acid crystals in the joints of gout patients under a microscope. For the first time, the fire in the foot had a visible villain, tiny gleaming needles lodged deep in the joint. He called them urate crystals. Gout finally had its smoking gun. And here's your second. Despite the mounting science, some Victorian publications still blamed the moon. Yes, a few insisted that lunar cycles excited the humors and triggered nighttime flares. It was pseudoscience dressed in a waistcoat. Historians still argue whether Victorian gout rates actually rose or whether it simply became more visible documented obsessively in journals, medical logs, and newspapers. What's clear is that public discourse about the disease shifted. Where Georgian poets had winked and limped with pride, Victorian sufferers apologized, moralized, and wrote long letters to medical journals. You pass through a spa town again? Bath perhaps now in full Victorian bloom. The waters are still foul, the cure still suspect, but the clientele has changed. You see more retired clerks, widowed baronesses, aging professors. Gout has trickled down the social ladder, no longer the sole property of dukes and kings. Victorian physicians, ever eager to moralize, begin publishing pamphlets with titles like Gluttony and Its Punishments or Of Sloth and Swelling. One particularly dramatic book cover features a devil poking a man's toe with a trident while a bottle of brandy weeps nearby. Even the Queen gets involved. Queen Victoria's court was riddled with gout. Her consort Prince Albert reportedly suffered a mysterious leg pain that some speculated was a dignified form of the affliction. Dignified or not, the court doctors prescribed a low purine diet, mostly fish rice, and the crushing absence of port wine. Meanwhile, Charles Dickens peppers his novels with gouty characters. In David Copperfield, Mr. Spenlow nurses his foot in a state of genteel self-pity. In Bleak House, there's Sir Leicester Dedlock, whose attacks always arrive at the most inconvenient moments, usually while trying to appear noble. Gout becomes literary shorthand for age indulgence and an inability to move on literally and figuratively, and the remedies. Oh, they're still wonderfully bonkers. One involves wrapping the foot in cabbage leaves soaked in milk. Another requires the patient to sleep with a clay brick, heated not for warmth, but to draw the humors downward. One popular Victorian tonic includes laudanum vinegar and crushed pearls. Elegant, ineffective, addictive. There's even an ad for a gout extractor machine, which allegedly uses magnets to draw pain from the joints. One customer review simply reads, "Still hurts." By this time, colchicum is in wider use, extracted from the autumn crocus and dosed in small bitter tinctures. It dulls the pain, though the side effects include nausea, dizziness, and spontaneous poetry about your ankles. Still, it becomes the standard remedy passed from doctor to doctor like a bitter family heirloom. As the century wanes and the gas lamps glow against a London fog, you hear the footsteps of progress in the distance. The automobile is coming. So is aspirin. But tonight, in this stiff-backed parlor full of ferns and moral discomfort, gout remains exactly what it has always been: an affliction that hurts the body, a condition that whispers about the soul, and a problem no one wants to admit they deserve. You sip tepid tea, your foot throbbing in rhythm with the grandfather clock, and think maybe one more biscuit. Just one. The ferns wilt a little in the stale drawing room air as you ease forward into the 20th century, where the gas lights flicker out for good and electricity hums softly behind freshly painted skirting boards. The world is changing. So is medicine. So are expectations. And gout, ever adaptable, shuffles awkwardly behind, still clinging to its reputation but beginning to lose its mystique. You're in a modest clinic now, perhaps in London or New York. Fluorescent lights buzz overhead. A clipboard is passed to you. The doctor wears a white coat instead of robes, and he no longer mutters about bile or the moon. He talks about uric acid levels, nods gravely, and jots notes with a ballpoint pen. There's progress in the air. Also the distinct smell of rubbing alcohol. In this new world of antiseptics and rising germ theory, gout is finally being stripped of its metaphor. It's no longer a symbol of excess or morality, it's becoming just a disease. Common, measurable, treatable. But don't worry, it still hurts like hell. You scan a pharmacy shelf full of glass bottles, syrups and tonics with grandiose names: Euroson Solugan Anti-Gout Elixir number 5. One advertises itself as science in liquid form. Another features a grinning cartoon, foot shaking hands with a white-coated doctor. Tasteful. Here's your first quirky tidbit: a 1920s advertisement for a product called Gout featured a man dancing, literally dancing with joy. The caption read, "No longer a prisoner of my slippers. It was made from magnesium salts and citrus oils." Reviews were mixed. And your second, some early 20th century doctors believed that chronic worry about one's social standing could exacerbate gout. Not because of stress per se, but because stress made people eat more rich food, drink more, and sleep less. In other words, the cause was still indulgence, just now emotionally justified. Historians still argue whether the drop in visible gout cases in the early 20th century was due to actual medical progress or a shift in who talked about it. With public health campaigns on the rise, people began to hide their symptoms. Gout became quietly shameful again, not aristocratically so, just inconvenient. Meanwhile, world wars reshaped everything. Food rations, often low in purines, briefly reduced gout across the population. Victory gardens, modest meals, and the sheer exhaustion of daily life didn't leave much room for flamboyant inflammation. But the moment the wars ended, gout reemerged with a vengeance. The post-war boom brought meat, booze, and comfort back to the table. Suburbs filled with steak grills and whiskey cabinets. Office workers traded physical labor for long desk hours, and slowly, silently, uric acid crept back into the bloodstream of modernity. And now the patients changed too. No longer just noblemen and statesmen, but accountants, engineers, teachers, salesmen. Gout was democratizing. It no longer needed your title, only your lifestyle. And what a lifestyle it was. In the 1950s and 60s, doctors began noticing a curious pattern. Gout cases rising in people who weren't wealthy but who ate like they were. The rise of processed meats, sugary drinks, and sedentary jobs created the perfect storm. One French physician called it the illness of prosperity without discipline. A bit judgmental, but also kind of accurate. Still, science was catching up. Blood tests could now detect uric acid with alarming precision. X-rays revealed joint damage. The microscope that once revealed Gerard's urate crystals became standard issue. And by the late 1960s, a miracle drug arrived, allopurinol. Allopurinol didn't just dull the pain, it reduced uric acid production at the source. For the first time, gout wasn't just manageable, it was preventable, treatable, maybe even forgettable. Doctors rejoiced. Patients limped with cautious hope. Pharmaceutical reps beamed. And yet some things remained unchanged. People still overindulged, still avoided checkups, still waited until the flare was unbearable before crawling to the clinic with a sheepish grin. You find yourself now in a mid-century living room. Walnut furniture, shag carpet, a muted television flickering with The Ed Sullivan Show. A man sits in an armchair, one foot in a bucket of ice, the other tapping to the music. He's wearing suspenders, drinking a highball, and complaining about that damn toe again. Progress, after all, is rarely total. Gout in the 20th century lost some of its glamour, some of its metaphysical weight, but it gained something else. Persistence. It refused to fade, refused to be erased. The king's affliction was now the everyman's ache. And so in a century of wars, revolutions, space travel, and microchips, your foot still burns, just like it did in Rome, just like it did in the court of Henry VIII, just like it will tomorrow. The television static fades and the shag carpet gives way to low-pile office carpet printer cables and the faint glow of a desktop computer. You're in the 1980s now, or maybe the 90s, it's hard to tell, because everything is beige and humming, and gout is once again adapting to its surroundings. Welcome to the modern workplace where the throne has been replaced by a swivel chair, the scepter by a mouse, and the goblet of wine by a plastic bottle of soda. And yet the pain in your foot is unmistakable. Gout, ever loyal, has followed us into the fluorescent age. You're in a cubicle farm, watching a middle manager grimace as he kicks off his loafers under his desk. His name might be Gary. Or Dale. He's 43, loves Italian cold cuts, and hasn't stretched in years. His big toe pulsing against his sock is glowing red like a tiny emergency beacon. In this era, gout starts to shed its aristocratic branding entirely. It becomes known as an old man's disease, or worse, a self-inflicted lifestyle condition. There's less sympathy now, less poetry, more pamphlets. Here's your first quirky tidbit. In the 1990s, a popular American TV doctor once described gout as the consequence of the American diet wrapped around the foot. That phrase stuck, and for a while it was the unofficial slogan of the affliction. And the second in Japan, gout saw a strange spike among young white-collar workers known as salarymen, thanks to their intense schedules, drinking culture, and penchant for organ meat served with after-hours beer. The local nickname, the businessman's limp. Historians still argue whether the modern rise in gout is a reflection of better diagnostic tools or a genuine explosion in dietary risk factors, sugar-processed meats, and the 1-2 punch of sedentary living plus midnight snacking. But what's clear is this gout is no longer rare. It's not even particularly special. It's become common. You now pass through a doctor's office in a suburban strip mall. The waiting room has a fish tank and a faded stack of Reader's Digest. The doctor prescribes you allopurinol without blinking, hands you a printout titled Managing Your Uric Acid, and tells you to cut back on red meat, shellfish, and soda. You nod, you lie. Because the reality of modern gout is that it's not caused by feasts anymore, it's caused by snacks. It's not the wine cellar, it's the vending machine. The uric acid comes not from imperial indulgence, but from corn syrup and convenience store burritos. And yet the pain hasn't changed. You watch as middle-aged men shuffle into clinics wearing orthotic shoes and sheepish expressions. "I thought this was just for dukes," one says. The nurse laughs and nods. Now it's for district managers. Celebrities, too, get caught limping. Reports surface of former athletes with swelling. A late-night host cracks a joke about too many shrimp cocktails. Gout briefly becomes a pop culture punchline until people realize how many of them have it or know someone who does. The pharmaceutical industry adapts, of course. Commercials appear on daytime TV with cheerful slogans like, "Take the first step pain-free," while animated uric acid crystals dissolve like snowflakes in a cartoon bloodstream. The pills work, but they're just one part of the problem. The other part, lifestyle, which, if we're honest, modern humans are famously bad at adjusting. Doctors recommend weight loss, hydration, low purine diets. Patients nod politely, then order pad thai and wash it down with a craft beer. You rest now in a modest living room with a couch that sighs when you sit. Your foot is elevated on a foam wedge. On the coffee table, a bottle of colchicine. Next to it, a diet soda. You're doing your best, most of the time. And in this moment, you understand something oddly comforting. Gout has always been about more than indulgence. It's been about habits, about humanity, about that eternal war between comfort and consequence. Whether you wear a crown, a cravat, or a clip-on badge, your body still keeps the receipts. And the toe still throbs. You squint through the blue glow of a smartphone screen. It's the early 21st century now, and the world is full of fitness apps, kale smoothies, and standing desks that everyone buys and almost no one uses. We're in the age of information, and yet gout still thrives like an old-school villain hiding in plain sight. You're in a co-working space. The floors are polished concrete, the coffee is artisanal, and the Wi-Fi password is something insufferably clever. A software developer not yet 40 winces as he shifts in his ergonomic chair. His foot is bare sock crumpled nearby, big toe elevated on a collapsible laptop stand. He's Googling toe pain after sushi and looking increasingly concerned. This is the new face of gout. It's younger, it's plugged in, and it's confused. Because in a world of wellness trackers, it still didn't get the memo that gout was supposed to be extinct. The culprit, often the same as always, food, drink, and stress. But now with a modern twist. Here's your first strange but true tidbit. Studies from the 2010s noted a direct correlation between sweetened beverage consumption, especially high fructose corn syrup in sodas and sports drinks, and spikes in uric acid levels. You read that correctly. Gout no longer rides in with the roast duck. And wine, it arrives in the third can of cola during a late-night coding sprint. And here's the second: some biohackers on Reddit once tried to cure their gout using a cocktail of bone broth, intermittent fasting, and cryotherapy. One of them claimed it worked. Another claimed it made him cry for 3 days. Neither has published peer-reviewed research. Historians, yes, even now still argue whether the modern gout surge is entirely lifestyle-based or whether genetics are finally being taken seriously. There's mounting evidence that hereditary uric acid processing plays a bigger role than previously admitted. But that doesn't stop your doctor from raising an eyebrow when you list your weekly diet and then glance down guiltily at your Crocs. You walk now through a wellness expo where personal trainers and nutritionists hand out pamphlets. One booth offers anti-inflammatory smoothies. Another has a foot massage robot called the Gout Master 3000. You don't ask questions. You just put your foot on the vibrating pad and pretend it's working. In the modern age, the treatments are more precise. Allopurinol is joined by febuxostat. Colchicine is rebranded, repackaged, and sometimes combined with NSAIDs. There's even a fancy injectable called pegloticase, reserved for the most stubborn cases. The science is sharp. The ads are sharper. But here's the catch. None of these treatments work if you don't stick with them. And the average modern patient, distracted, busy, often uninsured. Gout becomes yet another chronic condition shuffled beneath work deadlines. Childcare and whatever Instagram thinks counts as clean eating. You're at a dinner party now, urban upscale everything served on reclaimed wood. The host serves lamb tartare and sour cherry wine. You hesitate. You remember the brochure. You also remember that life is short, and gout doesn't show up immediately, right? Back home, you scroll through forums, Reddit, Facebook support groups, anonymous people with swollen joints and increasingly niche diets. One guy swears by turmeric and tart cherry capsules. Another says it's all a scam. Just take your meds and stop drinking IPAs. It's a modern conversation steeped in choice contradiction and crowdsourced cures. No longer confined to kings or curled-up uncles in armchairs, gout now lives on Fitbits and Slack channels, and in the inboxes of digital doctors offering telehealth consultations at 2 a.m. And yet, as you lie back with your foot-elevated screen, brightness dimmed, you realize something ancient lingers beneath it all. The pain hasn't changed. The fire in the joint, the sting when the blanket brushes your toe, the ache that makes you feel oddly medieval. It connects you not just to your past, but to the past. Romans, monks, dukes, bureaucrats, coders. You are now part of an unbroken line of swollen-footed humanity. And maybe, just maybe, that's worth limping through. The digital glow dims, and suddenly you're standing in the soft, insulated silence of a climate-controlled office. The kind with glass partitions, ficus plants that may or may not be real, and coworkers who nod politely while wearing noise-canceling headphones. It's the 2020s. The world is post-industrial, post-truth, post-carb, allegedly. But gout is very much present. You're wearing athleisure. You own a yoga mat. You eat quinoa sometimes, but your toe is on fire. Today, gout lives in your inbox. It flares up between Zoom calls. It waits until your busiest day and then wham, a medieval throb in a very modern sock. And it's not just you. You scroll your health app and find a surprising headline: gout rates are rising faster than ever among younger adults. You blink. You reread. The article cites the usual culprits: ultra-processed foods, high fructose corn syrup, craft beer, and yes, stress. A doctor on TikTok calls it tech broto. Another more charitable term, metabolic gout. A lifestyle disease dressed in compression sleeves and protein bars. Here's your first curious tidbit in the last decade. Emergency room visits for acute gout attacks have risen sharply in developed countries, especially among adults aged 30-50. And many patients are shocked to hear the diagnosis. I thought that was for old men, they say, or Shakespeare characters. And your second, in South Korea, a recent health study revealed that the #1 risk factor for early onset gout in men under 40 was, no joke, instant noodles. The humble cup of ramen has become an unsuspecting villain in the modern gout saga. Historians, or rather modern medical historians, still argue whether the disease has truly gotten worse or if better awareness is just revealing the tip of the uric iceberg. But ask any GP and they'll tell you the red swollen foot in the exam room is no longer rare. Or elderly. Or fancy. You walk now through a supermarket reading labels like they contain ancient runes. Low purine. No added sugar. Anti-inflammatory blend. You buy cherries, real ones this time, and a turmeric shot that tastes like spiced firewood. Your toe twinges. It's unimpressed. Modern treatments remain largely the same. Allopurinol is still the gold standard, though some prefer febuxostat. Colchicine is there for flares nestled next to the ibuprofen. But here's what's new. Lifestyle integration. Now you track your uric acid levels with an app. You get diet advice from an AI. You read subreddits full of strangers comparing toe photos like battlefield injuries. One guy swears by celery seed, another recommends barefoot grounding. You suspect both are secretly in pain, but modernity offers something no previous generation had: hyper-personal data. You know what you ate, how you slept, how much water you drank. You see your uric acids charted in pixels, and yet you still eat the bacon-wrapped scallops at your friend's engagement party. Because, well, life. You step now into a co-working gym, limping slightly. Your trainer asks if you sprained something. You say, nah, just the gout again. He raises an eyebrow. You change the subject. Gout in the 2020s is still awkward, still a little embarrassing. Still the kind of thing people think you can just fix with one cleanse and a daily walk. But the truth is more nuanced. Genetics, diet, hydration, medication, stress, sleep. It's all in the mix. It always has been. What's different now is the noise, the constant hum of information suggestions, hacks, warnings, and success stories. And in all that noise, your toe just quietly pulses. You lie back in your bed, foot on a memory foam wedge ambient playlist humming. Somewhere between the smart scale and the blood test, you find yourself thinking of kings, of bishops, of scholars and servants, of everyone who sat where you are now, wondering why one tiny joint can dictate the terms of your entire life. It's humbling, but it's also human. And tomorrow, after the swelling fades, you'll return to your emails, to your oat milk lattes, to your next mistake involving sushi and sparkling wine. Because gout doesn't just follow the rich anymore. It follows the real. The playlist fades to silence, and now you're standing in the whisper-clean hallway of a medical research institute. Cool LED lighting, softly humming machines, and a whiteboard covered in DNA diagrams and uric acid molecule sketches. It's the near future, or perhaps the slippery edge of the present. Gout has entered the genomic age, and you're here to witness its next awkward evolution. Your foot still throbs, of course. Some things don't change. But here, amid the scent of hand sanitizer and soy-based ink, the conversations sound different. They're not about port wine or powdered wigs. They're about genes, receptors, and interleukin pathways. You feel smarter. You also still can't fit into your left shoe. Gout is being rebranded not by patience, but by science. Here's your first offbeat fact. Researchers in the 2020s identified specific gene variants like SLC2A9 and ABCG2 that strongly influence how the body processes uric acid. These aren't just trivia, they're predictive. In a few years, you might know you're at risk for gout before you ever feel a twinge. And the second, a biotech startup recently trialed a gut microbiome therapy. Yes, bacteria that may help reduce uric acid levels. One strain, Lactobacillus plantarum X, showed promise in digesting purines before they could wreak havoc. The idea of probiotic gout prevention feels weirdly polite. Historians still argue, yes, still, whether gout's reputation can ever fully detach from its aristocratic past. Even with gene maps and digital health records, people still whisper about it like it's a lifestyle confession. But increasingly, doctors are seeing it as a complex condition, equal parts chemistry, circumstance, and compliance. You now walk through a virtual clinic. Yes, virtual. Your doctor appears on-screen avatar, glowing voice, smooth. You list your symptoms. They adjust your allopurinol dose and send a new prescription to your home with drone delivery. You're living in the future, but your toe still feels like it's stuck in the 18th century. Diagnostics are precise now. A finger prick can reveal your uric acid levels in real time. AI models predict your flare cycles. Your smartwatch gently vibrates when you haven't hydrated enough to prevent crystallization. You appreciate the warning, but you're also mildly annoyed. In a new clinical trial, researchers are exploring RNA-based therapies to silence the very enzymes that cause uric acid buildup. They call it silencing the spark. The idea stopped the fire before it ever ignites. It's impressive. It's hopeful. It's still early. And yet, for all the white lab coat innovation, many patients still live the same old pattern. They get diagnosed late. They delay treatment. They adjust their lives around pain like it's a roommate who won't move out. In low-income countries, gout is rising quietly, shadowed by processed diets, rising obesity, and unequal access to healthcare. A swollen toe doesn't always earn priority in a crowded clinic. In some cases, it's misdiagnosed entirely. In high-income countries, the story is different, but strangely parallel. Patients can treat it but often don't. They forget pills, skip blood work, wait until the pain returns to remember they're chronically ill. And all the while, pharma companies launch sleek campaigns, live free from flares. Reclaim your steps, each accompanied by smiling hikers and suspiciously perfect feet. You sip a turmeric ginger electrolyte beverage. Your foot is propped on a pneumatic cooling pad. A notification from your health app buzzes. Your uric acid is in range. Keep it up. You nod vaguely. The technology is helpful, but you miss something. You miss the candlelight, the letters written from bed, the quiet acknowledgement that some pains are older than reason. You think of Franklin, Voltaire, your ancestors and their gout stools. And somehow that lineage comforts you more than the AI graphs ever could. Because gout, even in its future form, is still a story. Your story. A burning thread woven through generations. Now tracked in pixels and blood markers, but still understood at its core by the way you flinch when your blanket brushes your toe. You log your symptoms, you close your laptop, you limp to bed. And the fire, as always, burns quietly beneath it all. Morning light creeps through half-closed blinds, and now you find yourself in a quiet, carpeted room with softly ticking clocks and waiting room chairs that seem designed to mildly disappoint. It's your rheumatologist's office, modern, tasteful, relentlessly beige. A poster on the wall depicts a joint cross-section in bright anatomical detail, the uric acid crystals, looking disturbingly like sugar shards in gelatin. This is where the modern war on gout happens, not on battlefields or banqueting tables, but in quarterly checkups and lab result printouts. Your blood work says one thing, your foot says another. Welcome to the 21st century medical standoff. And like any war, there are combatants. First, the drugs. Allopurinol remains the frontline soldier. It's reliable, cheap, and when taken consistently, pretty effective. Febuxostat joins the fray, marketed with a sleeker name but carrying its own risk profile. Then there's colchicine, the flare fighter, still as bitter tasting and quick acting as it was 100 years ago. NSAIDs line up behind it like archers ready to dull the aftermath. Then come the newer recruits, pegloticase, the infusion therapy for the stubbornly afflicted. It's fancy, expensive, reserved for the worst cases, the ones where traditional pills bounce off the inflammation like foam arrows on armor. You sit there, foot elevated, while a slow IV drip tries to rewrite your chemistry. Here's a strange but revealing tidbit. A few modern gout medications are now advertised using CGI animations of crystals, melting away, often accompanied by smiling patients, literally stepping back into their lives as if gout were a seasonal inconvenience instead of a chronic time bomb. And your second, a legal battle recently broke out over a generic version of allopurinol, not because it was unsafe, but because the patent holder didn't want to lose market share. In the background of every flare, someone somewhere is arguing about money. Historians still argue they never stop whether gout has truly become democratized or whether it's just shifted its cultural costume. Once called the king's disease, then the old man's curse, it's now something else entirely. A chronic condition, a silent burden, a footnote in public health. Statistics, and yet no less intrusive. You flick through a stack of informational brochures. Living well with gout. Trigger foods and you. Understanding your uric acid. All of them smiling, all of them pastel. None of them quite capture the feeling of being betrayed by your own big toe. You leave the doctor's office and find yourself in the pharmacy. You wait in line behind a teenager picking up acne cream and a retiree collecting blood pressure meds. Your turn comes. The pharmacist asks softly, "Still on the allopurinol?" You nod. It's not dramatic anymore, just routine. And that's the thing. The gout you live with now isn't theatrical or poetic. It's quiet, inconvenient, bureaucratic. It exists in refill calendars, insurance codes, and gentle warnings from your phone's health app. But don't be fooled. Beneath all the modern polish, it's the same old affliction. The same burn that chased kings and scholars, the same silent crystalline rebellion that humbles even the most disciplined body. You walk slowly out to your car. You wince slightly as you step in. You remind yourself to hydrate. You swear you'll skip the red meat this weekend. Then you drive home to tingling. Because even now, even with pills apps and high-tech scans, gout has a way of reminding you that you are human. That your body remembers every indulgence. That history doesn't just live in books, sometimes it lives in your bones. And it has a sharp, cruel memory. You step into a quiet, sunlit kitchen. The kettle is just starting to whistle. You're barefoot, moving slowly, carefully, because yes, the toe still flares sometimes. But it's different now. You know it. You've read the brochures, memorized the meal plans, tested the boundaries. Gout is no longer a surprise, it's a familiar rhythm. We're firmly in the present, or perhaps just beyond it. This is gout today. It's no longer a courtly curse or a philosopher's companion. It's a chronic condition with a billing code. Something your doctor sees your insurance processes and your smartwatch silently monitors while counting your steps. And yet it's still your story. Because gout always has a personal edge. It doesn't strike randomly, it waits, it watches, it catches you when you're off guard, when the party goes long or the second helping wins the argument. Today's gout isn't glamorous, it's not poetic, it's administrative. You open your medication cabinet. Inside are the usual suspects: a bottle of allopurinol, the occasional colchicine vitamin D, a magnesium supplement you don't entirely remember buying, and a half-used tube of Voltaren. You've become something you never thought you'd be: organized. But that doesn't mean it's easy. Here's your first modern tidbit. A global epidemiological study in 2022 found that more than 90% of gout patients who experience frequent attacks do not take their urate-lowering therapy consistently. Not because they don't want to, but because life quite simply gets in the way. And your second wearable tech is now being developed to detect uric acid levels through your sweat, a future where your wrist can warn your foot before anything starts. Historians still argue whether gout has lost its cultural identity. Stripped of its royal associations, it's now just another metabolic condition. But its narrative is deep, strange, resilient, and it quietly endures just like the people it afflicts. You glance out the window. The world is faster now. You're expected to keep up. No time for reclining chairs or opium-infused foot balms. But when the flare hits, it still demands the same thing it always has: stillness. And in that stillness, you remember the others. The emperor with his slippered foot, the monk with his psalms and poultice, the gentleman with the velvet footstool, the software engineer rubbing his toe under the standing desk. And you here with your cup of tea and your slow, practiced gait. You've become part of an invisible lineage. Not famous, not pitied, just quietly united by a shared condition that whispers through time. And when someone else says, "It's just my gout," you don't smile. You nod, you know, because gout today is both more and less than it used to be. Less status, less mystery, more science, more management, and somehow, despite it all, it still feels deeply personal. You stretch your leg out. The morning is calm. You're not in pain, not now. And that, in its own small way, is a triumph. You reach for your phone not to Google symptoms, but to log a flare-free week. You breathe. You start the day carefully, because gout isn't gone. But neither are you. The world slows now. You're no longer in a clinic, a castle, or a co-working pod. You're simply at home, your home, in the quiet pause that comes after sunset and before sleep. The lights are dim, the air is still, and your foot is resting on a soft cushion, warm and unbothered for the first time today. This is where the story tapers into the present moment. We've traveled together across centuries and empires, from Egyptian priests to Roman generals, from powdered courtiers to programmers in hoodies. Gout has worn many names, sat in many chairs, and sizzled through many unfortunate toes. And now it sits with you, patient, predictable, manageable, but never entirely silent. Tonight, as your mind quiets and your limbs soften, you let go of the idea that gout is something to conquer. You begin to see it for what it truly is: a long thread in the human experience. An unlikely companion, a red flare of history you carry quietly as others have before you. Here's your first curious detail. Despite all we know, scientists still don't fully understand why uric acid builds the way it does in some bodies and not others. Genetics microbiome. An evolutionary glitch. The truth is incomplete, as it often is. And your second or recent study suggested that moderate coffee consumption, yes, coffee, might actually lower uric acid levels. Perhaps it's poetic justice for all those medieval monks who abstained. Historians still argue whether gout will ever vanish entirely. Will it become a thing of the past like scurvy or powdered wigs, or will it always find a way to persist, slipping between the cracks of medicine and behavior, flaring up just as the world forgets? Only time will tell. But tonight you ease into sleep with the knowledge that you are not alone. You are one among millions, past and present, who have paused at the edge of pain and learned how to carry it with grace. Quietly, carefully. Your joints may creak, your foot may throb again, but for now there is rest. There is warmth. There is you still here, gently winding down. And now, dear listener, we leave behind the courtrooms and clinics, the velvet cushions and ice packs, the monarchs and microbiologists, The lights dim. The story softens. The air is quieter than before. You shift just slightly, your body relaxing deeper into the mattress. Your breath steady slow. You feel the shape of your limbs, the weight of your day slipping off your shoulders like an old coat. Your toes. Yes, even that toe are calm now, at peace. No flicker, no fire, just stillness. Let the history settle inside you. Let the laughter, the strangeness, the long echo of human discomfort fade gently into the background. It's not important now, not here. You are not in pain. You are not late. You are not being judged for what you ate or drank or forgot to do. You are simply resting, safely, quietly, just as someone else did long ago beneath candlelight or moonlight, or the warm hush of a linen sheet. You have walked through centuries tonight. You've seen emperors stumble, poets sulk, scientists search. And in the end, you've come to the same truth they did, that we endure, that we adapt, that even the smallest joint can carry centuries of stories. Close your eyes, let the room darken. Let your breath become the only sound you follow. You've heard enough for now. I'll be here with another story for you tomorrow night.